Service. Our focus is on historical topics relating to the Australian military. You can find us on Facebook and Twitter. Just search for Thanks for Your Service. Our website is www.thanksforyourservice.net, and you can also email us at info@thanksforyourservice.net. Author Michael Veitch describes it as the forgotten battle that saved the Pacific. His latest book is titled The Battle of the Bismarck Sea, The Forgotten Battle That Saved the Pacific, and he joins us for this two-part podcast series and tells us about his book. So joining us on the line from Melbourne is best-selling author, actor, broadcaster and RAF Reserve Officer Michael Veitch. Michael, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, David. Very nice to be here.
Now, the Battle of the Bismarck Sea, the forgotten battle that saved the Pacific, is the title of your latest book. Why is it forgotten?
Well, that's one of the things I can't answer, and that's open to all sorts of people's opinions. Why have we forgotten so much of our history, so much of our military history, and so much of the history that we can be awfully proud of, David? Why has it been forgotten? Well, I guess you have to ask, why was Kokoda forgotten for many years? I mean, you and I probably grew up when it was called the Kokoda Trail, which was never referred to in its day as the Kokoda Trail being an American word. And for all its faults, I think we have to thank Prime Minister Paul Keating for one of the people who actually brought the Battle of Kokoda to Australians' attention. But we're a funny lot, Australians. What can I say? I've often said that if we were Americans, things like Bismarck Sea and Kokoda and the defence of Moresby, which I have done a previous book about, the 44-day defence of Moresby, would all be on our stamps, but we're not. Now, I'm glad we're not Americans, by the way, David, and I hope you concur with that. But I don't really know. But it's a shame that these great epochs of our history have been forgotten, and that's why I write my books, to actually bring new generations of readers and people who are interested in this extraordinary period of the Second World War to light.
Can you give us a geography lesson and remind listeners of where the Bismarck Sea is?
Yes, it's often confused to people. People saying, "Oh, you're doing a book about the battleship Bismarck." I said, No, it's not. As we know, Otto von Bismarck, was the great statesman who united Germany in 1870, and that immediately set off Germany's quest to join the colony. The great scramble for the late great scramble for colonies in the last couple of decades of the 19th century, and Germany was one of the last takers, and we felt very jealous about it for the reason why the First World War got going. And so one of their colonial acquisitions was the Southwest Pacific, very close to us, and big chunks of Papua and New Guinea and the Solomon Islands, and all these little islands like Micronesia, island groups to the north of New Guinea became German colonies. So they named an area of ocean just to the north of New Guinea, between the northeast coast of New Guinea and the two big islands, New Britain and New Ireland. They named it after their great hero, Otto von Bismarck. Hence, it was and still is the Bismarck Sea. And that's where we're talking.
And in terms of the Battle of the Bismarck Sea, can you give us an idea of the lead up to the battle, and then we'll go through the battle itself and the aftermath?
Sure. Well, we're talking the latter part of 1942, when certainly the Japanese had come down from their 100-day blitz that began with Pearl Harbor, and not just Pearl Harbor, but attacks on Malaya and Hong Kong and Wake Island and all sorts of other places, in their one-hit strategy, which was to conquer all very quickly. There was no plan B, and that's what they planned to do, and very nearly succeeded. The rush to conquer by Imperial Japan, the end of 1941, was simply extraordinary and very successful. They rolled up all these places like Malaya. They crashed into Singapore, the impregnable Singapore, and they could have kept going if they hadn't had a bit of what they call victory disease or victory fever, where you can't quite believe how well you've done and you kind of doubt your own hand. If they'd actually sailed into Port Moresby Harbour in, say, maybe January or February 1942, they probably could have taken it, and that would have been it. They didn't. They then paused. Then they tried to actually expand their initial conquests and tried to go further north and tried to go further east. And they failed to do that, and that was what the Battle of Midway essentially was about, and where they lost all their aircraft carriers. Then, of course, the great attempt to take Moresby over the Owen Stanley Ranges that we all know about, the epic of the Kokoda Track, and they got to within sight of Moresby and then were gradually pushed back. Well, they actually were called back, the Japanese, but they were also pushed back. Then towards the end of 42, mopping them up at the tail end, or the beginning end of the Kokoda Track, which are the Japanese bases of Buna and Gona. Little villages and mission stations before the war. They were on the north coast of New Guinea, where the Japanese had fortified them. And the Americans started to come in, and the Australians fought these dreadful battles where disease was rife and the conditions were ghastly in New Guinea. Now, at this point, Japan was down but not out. And people forget that. People forget that people often tend to think that after Japan was foiled to take Moresby at Kokoda and also at Milne Bay, which I've also written about, a story I've also written about, they were basically done and dusted. It's not nothing could be further than the case. Japan in the first month of 1943 was still a tremendous force to be reckoned with. They had a massive population, large industries, and a completely clear supply line from Japanese mainland through their big bases that they'd picked up. Thank you to the former German colonies we were talking about before, particularly a place called Truk Lagoon in the middle of the Pacific that the Japanese fortified as a huge Navy base in the interwar years in the 1920s. Well, they used that, and there was a clear line, a relatively short line of supply from Japan to their outer extremities of their conquests in New Guinea. Now, yes, they'd lost their carriers, but what they decided to do was to go back to their initial footprint of conquest and really try and take Moresby. If they could get Moresby and hold New Guinea, that's really was their main aim, because even though they probably had no intention and certainly no capability of invading or taking Australia in any meaningful way, all they had to do was to basically checkmate us out of the war by controlling the sea lanes to the north, controlling the supply routes from the United States to Brisbane and Sydney and Melbourne. Because then Australia would have been very isolated, and we would have been effectively a kind of I hesitate to say the word spent force, but certainly removed from the picture. That's what they still intended to do. They had failed to take it by direct assault for the Battle of the Coral Sea. They'd failed to take Moresby over the overland route. They'd failed at Mill Bay, and so it was going to be fourth time lucky. So what they thought they could do was to build up their bases that they already had on the northern coast of New Guinea, particularly the town of Lae that they had invaded and taken, I think, in January 1942, and they'd built up significantly since that time. They tested it in January 1943, the first weeks of January 1943, by sending a convoy down from Rabaul. That's the other big navy, a big port that they'd got in the beginning of the war, the former Australian administrative capital of our Australian territory of Papua on the big island of New Britain. So they had that, and they wanted to test the waters by sending a convoy from Rabaul to Lae, I think on January, the first couple of weeks of January, and it was a wild success. They were over the moon, the Japanese. They realised, we've got the Australians, we've got the Americans, because even though we lost Buna, we lost Kokoda, they're now exhausted, which was absolutely true. Our armies were spent at this stage of the war. The Americans were only really getting going. They had no idea of the ferocity of the Japanese fighting man. We had taken a battering, even though it had been a kind of a sort of a victory at Kokoda, but the Australian army was not in good shape. So that the Japanese thought, all we need to do is build up our northern coast New Guinea bases, and from then we can take places like WAU, W-A-U, which was an airstrip in the mountains not far from Lae. There'd been an assault on it earlier, but it had failed, but they reckon they could get it the next time. So places like Salamaua, WAU, Lae were all the Japanese reckoned they needed to restart their conquest of Moresby, and then it would have been game over. The convoy that arrived at Lae, virtually unmolested, they'd lost a ship in it. Now, these are big old freighters that the Japanese had, and they were prepared to lose up to half of their convoys in this period of the war, and they still would have considered it a success. They lost one ship, and most of the supplies for that were offloaded to another ship. When the news of this convoy having gotten through filtered to the American and Australian higher commands, they considered it a catastrophe and a disaster. They said, this can't happen. They even tried to attack it by air, but they just got it wrong. They had no system. The B-17s went in alone. There was no coordination. They realised the navigation of the American pilots was poor. Their morale was poor. The B-17s had basically been the clapped-out jobs that had sort of limped over from the fall of the Philippines. Half of them couldn't get oil filters, couldn't get air filters, couldn't get the right oil, couldn't get bearings. They were sort of parked wingtip to wingtip at Townsville and Charters Towers waiting for supplies to come in. The American airmen were demoralised and had no real kind of esprit de corps. And then this Japanese convoy arrives, reinforces their base at Lae very successfully. It's considered a very, very bad chapter in the war in Japan. This is this was the climax of a couple of things at this period of the war. Earlier, there had been, thank goodness, a new American commander arrive, Army Air Corps commander, a man called George Kenny, who came to Australia and was like, oh, bloody hell, what have I got to deal with here? Here are these thousands of men of my Air Force, Army Air Force, dispirited, badly supplied, no morale. I've got to build them up again. And that's what he did. He also developed new bombing techniques, low-level bombing. He was a proponent of low-level bombing. He wasn't part of the kind of bomber mafia that operated in Europe, where you had to hit a town from 18,000 feet with 1,000 aeroplane. He was a much more strategic Kenny than that. And he said, well, you can't see anything anyway. It's all jungle. You've got to get down low to the treetops to bomb anything anyway. So let's try it that way. So gradually, the last few months of 1942, he was building up his Air Force, which he was able to rename the 8th Air Force. And then this disaster happens. The Australians, Americans said to us, look, if the Japanese can keep doing this, we're stuffed. There's nothing we can do. We can't attack them. We've got no technique for attacking their naval convoys. They often arrive in poor weather, so we can't see them. They're often very heavily defended from the air. They're escorted by Japanese destroyers. That Japanese destroyer force was probably the most efficient naval force of just about any naval force of the Second World War. The Japanese destroyer commanders and crews and the ships themselves were absolutely brilliant. And they had thousands of them, which they'd been busily making during the 20s and 30s. And they were very heavily armed, particularly with anti-aircraft fire. And they were a very efficient mode of naval warfare. They're often convoys were often escorted by several Japanese destroyers, and they were a formidable thing to attack from the air. It was then discovered after the success of this Japanese convoy, which I think was called Convoy 18, then our wonderful code breakers in Melbourne was the kind of Bletchley Park of, and Townsville were the Bletchley Park of Japanese code breaking in the Allied forces during the Second World War. They picked up the Japanese were cock a hoop about this Convoy 18, and they were planning another one, a much bigger one, which was going to set sail from Rabaul, and they knew this because they broke the Japanese code, on February 28th, the last day of February 1942. It was going to head to somewhere in New Guinea, they didn't know where yet, and they knew they had to stop it because they picked up it was going to be something up to 8 ships, I think, 8 big freighters, crammed, and you could, with the Japanese army at this stage, you could put an entire division in a convoy of that size, not just a couple of battalions that had gone through before, and they realised they had to stop it. They had to find a way to stop it. Entered to the scene the Australian contingent of this story in the form of a kind of one of our really early flying war heroes who'd been a short Sunderland pilot in the first couple of years of the war with 10 Squadron. Wing Commander William Bull Gehring. Short, stocky, gruff, bad-tempered, probably a bit of a bully, if his son, who I've become friends with, is anything to go by.
Yeah.
But when he came back from having won one of Australia's first DFCs in the Second World War, he came back to Australia a war hero, and his tour gone. His tour brilliantly carried out. They said, "Well, what do we do with you?" And Gehring said, "Oh, well, the Japanese are going to come into the war soon, so put me up to Townsville and I can help run the Air Force." And they go, "Oh, don't be ridiculous." "Yeah, well, whatever you think." That's why they gave him that job. He knew exactly what he was doing, and he knew how badly organised the Royal Australian Air Force was. He'd even done things in Britain. He'd even gone and he'd sort of watched the Battle of Britain taking place and how well the RAF was organised. And he went into a couple of those wonderful ops rooms and just watched how they did it, and even pinched a couple of the pieces of stationery of Royal Air Force sort of, aircraft sighted sort of stationery and copied it and set up his own kind of base and control station in Townsville before the Japanese came into the war. They thought he was mad. Of course, then Japan did come into the war, and they thought he was a genius. And he was, in a way. Now, he was in charge of the Royal Australian Air Force northwest area. Northeast area. And I confused because they kept changing it. It was just north and northeast. And I can't remember if it started northwest and northeast or started just north and they made it northwest. But anyway, the area of control, which was where we were fighting, was Wing Commander, maybe been a group captain at this stage, I can't remember, but he was in charge of it. Now, he was good friends with Kenny, the American general in charge of the 8th Air Force. They were good mates. They were very similar people. They were kind of outliers. They weren't fancy. They weren't friends with politicians or senators. They didn't have a glamorous sort of social life. They were just very, very accomplished warriors, both of them. And he knew, and he was very blunt about telling the Americans, you don't really know what you're doing. You're turning out boys with no navigation skills. Gehring was a one of the world's great navigators, navigator par excellence. Navigation was his big thing. So he was very concerned when stories about the American Thunderbolts, and this is a true story, a flight of American Thunderbolts arrived in Cairns, were ordered to, it was one of the few or was it Lightning? I think it was Thunderbolts. Someone who, Peter Dunn, who does Australians at War, told me it was Thunderbolts, so I'll believe Peter. The story that American fighter pilots came out and were told to go from Cairns to Port Moresby. So how do we get there? Well, just go north. Just follow the coast and just keep going north, and you'll see land, and turn right, and then you'll see a harbour, and you'll see the airstrip. Easy. So they did, and the American boys flew up from Cairns, followed the Cape York Peninsula, then followed around the tip of Cape York Peninsula, and started flying south because they were told to keep the coast on their left, ran out of petrol, and crash landed in the Gulf of Carpentaria. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
And this is true.
Yeah.
And this is the standard training that the American pilots, I mean, there's nothing to take away from American pilots. They were wonderfully brave and terrific fellows, all of them. And they were very supportive of the Australians and grateful for the Australians, even though we were far the lesser player in this massive story. But Goering said, this convoy that we know is coming is going to get through unless we have a plan. And he went to General Kenny's 2IC, and his name has escaped me for a moment, but it was outside a tent, a command and control tent in at 12 Mile Strip at Port Moresby. And in the sand, or in the clay or the mud, Bull Goering got this senior American general and said, this is what we have to do. And he got a stick and he drew a diagram. And he said, this is how we have to attack. We've got to have, and he drew a kind of what looked like a big triangle, like a beehive. And at the top of the beehive, he said, right, these are your lightnings. These are your top cover. Underneath, you have your high altitude, your fortresses, and the handful of B-24s that has arrived at this stage from the United States. Then you have your medium bombers, your B-25 Mitchells. Then down below you have your specially adapted strafing attack Mitchells, B-25s, and then you also have your low-level skip bombing B-25s. Then under that you have the people who go in first, which are my boys, the Bristol Bow Fighters of 30 Squadron RAAF. This is how you're going to have to do it, otherwise you will fail. And the American general said, just thank God, he said, Bull, you're right. We don't have a plan. We failed last time, and nothing I know of is telling me that we're not going to fail again. So we're going to try your plan. And they went straight over to General Kenny, and Kenny agreed. And he said, well, what do we do? And he said, well, we have to have a rehearsal. Now, this is unheard of for the Americans. What, a rehearsal? Yeah, we're going to have a rehearsal. We've got to do this at a rehearsal, and we'll attack an old freighter that's been lying on a passenger ship that's been lying on a Port Moresby reef for 20 years. It was called the Pruth, P-R-U-T-H. And the very next day, that night, they wrote out the commands. The teleprinters started spitting out the information. They went around. Thank goodness all the airstrips were pretty close together. So that day, and it was almost as the Japanese convoy was leaving Rabaul, they went round and briefed all the pilots, saying, this is what you have to do. You guys go in first. This is your timetable. Stick to your timetable. Both fighters, you go in first. First, strafe the ships from stem to stern. Then the medium bombers go in. Then the high-level bombers come in. And if there's Japanese fighter cover, we'll have the lightnings above them giving fighter protection. So they had a rehearsal. Nothing like this had ever been done in just about the history of air warfare. And that's, I mean, you didn't rehearse. It wasn't a play. It wasn't a piece of theatre. It was something that you got orders and you did. The idea of having to rehearse it was kind of quite bizarre, but rehearse it they did. And thank God, because the rehearsal was a disaster. Goering had boasted quietly with look, you American pilots are pretty crappy, but my Australian boys, they're the real deal, and they'll show you how to do it. Well, 30 Squadron let him down that day because they were late. So that all the pilots, all the crews were briefed. I mean, it was all too hurried. That's the trouble. But they were briefed. and they were told to turn up at and basically perform their manoeuvres over this ship. General Kenny and Wing Commander Goering watched the rehearsal from a hill, and they realised it was a disaster. So they went around again that night and tore these young men a new arsehole, basically, saying today was not good, tomorrow has to be better because the Japanese are coming. And sure enough, they got the alert that the Japanese convoy had made its way down New Britain into the Bismarck Sea and were approaching their target of Lae. There was not much room for error. Not much room for error. The most feasible place to attack the Japanese convoy was pretty close to their destination point of Lae. It was very hard to coordinate it. The weather was on the Japanese convoy's side for the first few days, and then they thought they were home and hosed. The Japanese thought they'd lost one ship, a Catalina, had attacked one of the ships and sunk it, and then nothing. And then they actually lost sight of the convoy over the past 72 hours. But then they found it again. Then it turned up, approaching Lae a few hours from Lae. So this is March the 3rd we're talking of now, and suddenly the weather cleared, and all these American and Australian airmen early that morning got their orders to fly to Cape Ward Hunt, which was a little speck to coordinate the formation, and we're talking about possibly up to 80 or 90, even 100 aircraft were to coordinate at their designated altitude over Cape Ward Hunt, and then proceed to the battle area, which was a designated coordinate in the middle of the Bismarck Sea. And there's a wonderful story of a gun emplacement on Cape Ward Hunt being under construction still, and the army fellows suddenly seeing these Beaufighters turn up and start circling, and then the American plane starts circling, and suddenly there's 100 aircraft over their head, and the roar of it was like nothing they'd ever seen. Nothing like this had ever been seen in the Pacific, full stop, and nothing would be seen till much later in the Pacific War. But this tower of aircraft assembled over Cape Ward Hunt and got the word to proceed, and they did. And the trouble with writing about the Battle of the Bismarck Sea, David, is that the actual battle only lasted 20 minutes because it was such an incredible success that that's all it actually took. When the aircraft of the Bismarck Sea battle assembled, they then made their way. And yes, there were the Japanese convoy. The Japanese initially thought that their story, because there were quite a few survivors from the battle on the Japanese side, and they wrote diaries, some of which were recovered later. And there was like a couple of the big ships were having a kind of a parade, like briefings on what to do when you get to Lae, because we're nearly there. And so they were so cocky that they'd succeeded. They basically thought, they'd won. And then suddenly these Beaufighters turn up. And the Beaufighters were ordered to go in first and basically decapitate the ships. That is, try and strafe them with their 4 20mm cannon and 4, or was it 6, I can't remember, on the Beaufighter 303 machine guns. Or did they have .5s? I can't remember either. Sorry, the eggheads out there will correct me if I'm wrong, David. And the strange thing happened when the Beaufighters started to approach the ships, because normally it's very difficult to strafe a ship from stem to stern because the ship will maneuver, and it's very hard to yaw an aircraft to actually keep up with it. But what the Japanese ships did was swing their bows towards the oncoming bow fighters of 30 Squadron because they thought they were torpedo bombers. They were trying to present the smallest possible target for a torpedo run, but they didn't realise they were about to be shot up from bow to stern, and they were. And most of the ships received this really fierce treatment of the bow fighters coming in low, lifting their nose and destroying the decks of the ship, and particularly killing the command structure, literally. The cannons firing into the windows of the bridge in a split second killed the captain, killed the navigation officer, so the people down below on the ship didn't know what was happening. Then, sure enough, the Americans started to do their skip bombing, which were the Mitchells that had been developed to drop a bomb low on the water and have it tossed along like a pebble. It's very hard to hit a ship from 20,000 feet or even 8,000 or 5,000 feet, but to get down really low is the way you did it. So that's what happened. So the ships of the Japanese convoy, the first one they got through was called 18. This one was called Convoy 81 in some weird kind of symmetry. As I said, 20 minutes was all it took for this incredibly bloody but incredibly one-sided battle to take place. None of the ships got through to Lae. They were all checked and sunk on their 11th hour. Actually, that's not quite true. One of the ships that had been sunk in the middle of a storm 48 hours earlier picked up the survivors and raced ahead and dropped them at Lae. And they're the only offloaded people from the Japanese convoy that arrived at Lae. But the rest of the convoy didn't make it. As I said, the cargo ships were all made into blazing wrecks. Some of them had nothing but aviation fuel, so they were like sort of flaming torches. The fires were so fierce that the hulls of the ships actually glowed white hot and started to melt, is how fierce the heat was from some of them. One of the escorting destroyers was out of control and actually collided with one of the cargo ships that was supposed to be escorting. One of the Japanese destroyers had its stern blown off, and that rolled over and sunk. Not all the Japanese destroyers were sunk. I think two were sunk, but all the cargo ships were sunk, and that was what was being aimed for. All left blazing, dead in the water hulks. The Australians and Americans couldn't believe how easy and how successful it had been. And we know what it was like because the great Australian war photographer Damien Parer, who had just happened to attach himself to 30 Squadron RAAF in the weeks prior to the battle, had brought his movie camera along for the ride, so to speak, and filmed the battle, filmed it brilliantly. And a few weeks later, the Australian newsreel cinemas were showing Damien Parer's film Bismarck Sea Convoy Destroyed, and you can see it on YouTube, and it is quite amazing.
Michael continues telling us about his book in podcast number 46. Leave a comment on our Facebook page, and if you're listening to us via iTunes or other podcast apps, please leave a review. Your review helps others find our podcast. You can help support this podcast via Patreon or Buy Me a Coffee. The links are on our website, and your support helps us with the production of this podcast. Thanks for listening.